So anarchy is much lambasted in media. You see shows like V for Vendetta and the Anarchist Cookbook, and there's all kinds of things that make anarchy seem like it is just chaos, and that the only thing that could result from anarchy would be just total oblivion of any sort of regular society. And then you have people who say anarchy is really more akin to voluntarism. It's an opt in type of situation where free peoples freely associate and do what they want. I think we should have a conversation about this, Lucas, where we think about what it might look like if we interacted in a free society and people could voluntarily decide what they wanted to associate rather than having some state sponsored leviathan that is enforcing and controlling behavior. How much have you thought about this, Lucas? Is this on your mind? And I'd also like to welcome Adam back to the stage. Adam, thanks for coming back on the show. I know that this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Morning, Adam. Morning, Rusty. It is near and dear to my heart. Although I was previously, volunteerism as a term hadn't really popped up on my radar, but as you describe it in the show opening, I'm very partial to that understanding and movement in the world. I think of that in terms of liberty. Liberty means to move about like free air. I think in all my thoughts about politics, I am constantly thinking about how are we running away from kings? How are we running away from top-down organization of society? But when I think about anarchy, sort of where I draw a line or draw many lines is wondering, at what level of society is that optimal? Because this notion of sovereign citizens or, or preppers or people who are self-sufficient and living on their own, I think it's maybe attractive at first glance, but I don't know that that's the way that we want to live or is the best way to structure and order society. And if it is for some people, the question then becomes, how many people does it take to band together to enforce their worldview on those who are have a smaller group? So this is when I talk with anarchists, this is what I'm constantly thinking about. So when I think about maybe volunteerism and this multiplicity of alliances and being able to join them, having the liberty to join them, I think that's ultimately what we're moving towards in the world. I sometimes wonder if our concept of a state continues to exist. And when it comes to states, that's when I begin to think about what do they tax, and what if we have multiple monies, how can we begin to break up the enormity of the state by breaking up their power into jurisdictions and what they tax and setting those rules for what they tax.
Bitcoin is the ultimate embodiment of voluntarism.
Oh God. Oh God.
Come on, it has to be, right?
Oh, and now everybody go out. Bitcoin or MicroStrategy. And now
Not MicroStrategy. No, that is definitely no.
Well, ultimately, like when you talk about anarchism, you get 20 anarchists in a room and you have 100 different kinds of anarchism, whether it's anarcho-veganism or anarcho-feminism or anarcho-communism. But what it really means is, how do people interact with each other in their natural state? And what I mean by is like how we've evolved as animals, as creatures to work with each other. And when you think about things like a fiat currency or a government that's forced upon people in an area, that's not a real natural state. Go back to like when you have like a border between two countries, you see the birds flying over without passports just fine. But why do we as animals need that? We really don't. And a lot of people will jump, well, doesn't that mean everyone has to be self-sovereign? You can be self-sovereign. There's nothing wrong with that. but you got to work with other people and form unions with others. And so, in a real, as how I see a voluntarist anarcho-capitalist society, you would be banding with other people and creating syndicates or insurance plans or all sorts of different things. But you get to voluntarily choose that. And what really gets frustrating with today's society and what we expect as the norm, and we'll probably see our whole lives, is this idea that, well, 49% of the people in this far way land voted this way who live different lives than you, and we're going to force our wills and rules upon you. Ultimately, you should be able to choose which people's rules that you abide by. And ultimately, the biggest check that has to be there is just making sure that you're not using aggression towards other people. And a lot of voluntarists and anarchists talk about that. It's called the non-aggression principle, or NAP. And ultimately, as long as you're not defrauding other people or stealing from other people or murdering other people, who cares what they're doing? Just let people band together.
Well, Adam, when I look down that glass into the future, and I think about a world in which people can jump in, volunteer for everything, the question that jumps into my mind is what happens if what happens with debt? You know, who enforces debt? And if, you know, say I bet the farm,
Yep.
or I lose my farm and I don't want to give it up, you know, who who enforces the rules and who forgives debt in a volunteerist world?
Well, it's ultimately comes down to contract that you're doing with the groups that you're doing business with. If you're not paying back a debt and you're defrauding uh, someone, there there is a point where now you're actually being the aggressor. And once you break the non-aggression principle, then you're basically saying, I'm an animal, treat me as such. I mean, you look at things like even with the Old West, everyone talks about how it was a very violent time. Everyone thinks about gun shooting at the OK Corral, but it was actually pretty peaceful per capita. And it's because people would not steal from each other. And if you did steal someone's horse or something, they would form a posse and string you up on a tree. And there is a concept of where you need to have forgiveness, and there is nothing wrong with a group of people forming a syndicate that has some sort of forgiveness plan in it, some sort of charity. Think of churches or even the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not a religious person myself, but you look at some of the charities they did, sometimes for bad intent, they really did help people because they cared about those things. And people do naturally do that. But a voluntary system for that is going to be much more efficient than, trying to set up bureaucracies to handle this.
Is it a size thing? Because I think about like what it means to form a syndicate and have people freely associate within a syndicate. And somewhat it makes me think we might have had these things when we were smaller groups of people. And then as those syndicates got much, much larger, it evolves into this beast that we have now that is this gargantuan federal agency that sits above us that controls what we're thinking and doing. Is it that we just have to try to keep these things as small as possible? And I'm thinking somewhat about maybe how Native American tribes work, although I don't think that they were completely voluntary, because I don't think you could just go join a different tribe. Could you, Lucas? I don't think they could just move around, did they?
Depends on how old you are. But the the Native American peoples often took um, well, yes and no. But maybe more of their identity was not about um, where they were born or who their parents were. In some way, it was, but it was also about, you know, what resources they protected. And I think if we are to if we are to get past these behemoths that the federalist movements in the world, the global, I mean, what's the difference between federalism and global capitalism? They each are these behemoths and come from I don't know, come from I would say come from a zero sum notion of the world, and part of that comes from this idea that there's that you can always take from somewhere else. I mean, when I think about economics or the the religion of the world today, it is based on this notion of endless resources, of infinity. And I don't know that that's true. And so when I think about how we go back to worlds where we do have smaller groups and they are not overtaken by larger groups, it's a world in which everyone agrees that they are protecting and taking care of the world. Um, the Native American political system was called an altepetal, um, ALTLPETL, and that meant hill water. That was the Nawa name for a town. A town was somewhere that you had water and you had a hill. And if you start to look back to the, I don't know, the political areas of power, they all were based on watersheds. And it's interesting to look at the, say the state lines that were decided in the United States. Look at the East and look at the West. The East is divided up by rivers. You have all these sort of strange looking states. You get out to the West and you have these boxes. Those boxes were intentionally drawn by the House of Representatives of the federal government to keep the West dependent, to keep it fighting amongst each other, to subvert the people that already lived there, both the native peoples but also the Spanish, because they wanted to divvy up the watersheds and to keep a fight going on about water. And Adam, you said earlier that the West was one that was largely peaceful, but I look at the West, I don't see it that way. There were those who had an enormous amount of power, and it might not have all been gunsmoke, but there was a lot of taking that happened in the West, taking from native peoples, but in the following times there was a lot of taking by the powerful. And it's, we also look at the West and we talk about all the public land in the West. Hand in hand with the public land is the large private tracts, private land grants in New Mexico and in Colorado, the ranches of California, and those, strangely enough, wound up in the hands of rich Europeans.
And you're absolutely correct. I mean, I'm not trying to romanticize the West, saying it was 100% peaceful. And what happened to the native people was atrocious and a tragedy. But if you look at just the scope of what it was like for the settlers, I mean, you could maybe have one lawman and covering several different counties. This isn't the society we see today, where you can't even walk a couple blocks without seeing a cop pull through. And there's a reason for that, because at least within the scope of the settlement societies there, if someone was aggressive towards other people, everyone would band together and form these posses and handle them. And this even happens today. If you go out to like the Dakotas, especially towards the western end, but a little bit on the eastern end, and talk to some of the people there are people who do things like, whether it's starting a forest fire or, hurting a young child or something, and those people are disappeared. And it's because the society bands together and forces that. The biggest thing is you want to get away from this point where you're aggressing and setting your own life's culture on another forcefully, just like you wouldn't want to steal their money from their wallet or things like that. It happens, but you have to look at it from the guise of statistics. Statistically speaking, the Old West settlement society was much more peaceful than the societies we see today.
Well, there was also, I mean, they had a lot. It was a lot sparser population. The in some ways, I think too, what
Well,
they
is that part of the key? Is sparse population and very distributed individuals? When you crowd people closer together, this is when things start to go awry. Is it that again, it's size and its density that really starts to cause these things to come into play, and that may be why this was more manifest in the West, because there was so much open land. If you didn't like your neighbors, you could just move a little ways down the road, whereas in Europe you have a lot higher density. There isn't anywhere to go. Most of the land is fairly well populated and settled in most spots.
I mean, I laugh, I chuckle as you say that because when I was on the town board, like all the complaints came to us from the the subdivisions of town that had that had the smallest lots. And so if there was a third of an acre lot, and there was a quarter acre, there was a subdivision of third acre lots or 2/3 acre lots, and there was quarter acre lots. The people who lived in the quarter acre lots are more bound to like show up with disputes. I think that also what was going on in the West was the Homestead Act, the giving away of land. I mean, you know, giving away, quote, people had to pay it back or to prove it up. There were conditions, but I think part of what the piece of the West was about was the state was giving rewards. And when I think about the success of states or the success of societies, in some ways it's what can the state provide, or what do people share? And I think for societies to be
Pretty dubious what they were actually providing, though. If you think about a Homestead Act, it's like, yeah, you can go out there and settle that thing and it's going to be yours. It's like, it's not like they're actively helping you to settle that land. You had to build the cabin, you had to till the ground, you had to cut down the trees. I mean, that was all on the settler himself.
well.
Exactly. Having a state come in and say that, I'm anointed by my government position, or I'm a king, or anointed by God, and oh, I'm giving you that land. That is not a gift from them whatsoever. That is just them making a decree, trying to put their own force and authority over something else. Really, what you own and what you control is what you own and you control. That's what it really comes down to.
Well, this is where again I go back to these notion of taxes and what we fund the government with, or what you pay your taxes for. Um, and it wasn't just land with the Homestead Acts. I mean, the Department of Agriculture was created to provide seeds and to provide advice to people who are moving west and building these farms. When we talk about seed capital today, seed money in capital investment, that comes straight from the Homestead Act and the government's intervention to help people get on their feet and to join this agrarian movement.
Wait, so how did that work? They would send you out with a bag of seeds and three gold pieces and tell you to go settle that land and them our hills?
No, they had I mean, still to this day you have ASCS office. You had the Federal Land Bureau was with the offices, and you would go stake your claim and or apply to purchase a section. Then you'd go back to the same office. They would have bags of seed. They would say, the government, part of the reason that the federal government, exerts or maintains the argument that it has a stake in controlling the lands in the West and hasn't ceded that all to the states that it created, is it says too, well, we surveyed this land. We sent out we sent out surveyors to assess what rocks were in the ground, what minerals are in the ground, what the water profile was, what were the best agricultural products for this area. So in, say, the Great Plains, they would distribute seeds. And
I think what Adam was getting at is when you actually go out and you possess that land, if some marauder comes by, it's you that has to defend it. It's not like you could call up the police or the federal government and say, "Come help me." There was no phone. There was no way to call anybody for help. You had to control it. You had to possess it. And so even if you got some modicum of seeds or whatever that you got to go out there with, really it was the settler, their family, and their free association with other people in the area that actually took control of it. And probably there was other people there that they had to take it from.
I don't know. When I think about the marauders that won, I think about banks. I look at property or land ownership and home ownership in the United States, and I say I think the banks are the marauders and the banks have won.
But the banks are the marauders and have won because of these governments enabling them to do that. In fact, a lot of our history in the United States, these banks have been fought back and haven't existed. It's not until the last century where we've really seen them blow up to the proportions they are. And ultimately, like, you cite things like the Department of Agriculture, investing in these areas and bringing in seeds, but I can make more citations on ways they've stifled innovation or production. Like when during the Great Depression, you were paid not to plant your crops so you wouldn't bring up prices. How is that good for anyone? How is that good to limit the supply of food for people? How is it good to tell people to stop producing? How is it good for, a massive amount of land that no one's ever going to touch, which has resources that can be used to build things in those areas, are untouchable? You can't log in a lot of areas, and we're importing lumber from other countries. It doesn't mean that you don't want to save parts of the environment, but the extremes that the government has come in is ridiculous. And I don't think that our society and our American way of life is because of these government institutions giving away seeds or things like that. I think our society and our way of life is good despite of all those things.
Well, so I very interesting, good points with especially the point at which the government began to pay farmers not to produce, and they're implicit in this discussion that we're having too is this priority that we put on agrarian, people bound to the land over service. That goes back to Roman times. I think there's something to that. I don't mean to poo-poo that at all. In fact, I grew up on a farm. I think that part of what went wrong was the reliance on gold and silver that so many people who talk about sovereignty also talk about some like money that's independent from the government. But look at what the one I don't know if you saw in Canada just forced a dairy farmer who had 30,000 gallons of milk more than was his quota, and they forced him to pour it out because they're trying to control prices and to keep prices up. That was true, Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture under FDR in the 30s. He had the same policies: burn crops and set quotas. Raisin farmers in California just a couple of years ago were sued by the raisin growers cooperative, Volstead Caperac, who are trying to control the prices of raisins and did not want them glutted by farmers dumping all their raisins on the market. So this is where I think this notion of capitalism and of economy that we have in the world today is absolutely bankrupt.
And you even look at a case that's happening now more recently in the US with, the bird flu scare. A couple chickens get sick and there is an order to destroy all the poultry in there. And this is where we've seen prices change with eggs and things like that. Now, you don't want to sell sick poultry or anything that can harm anyone. But if you just look at how evolution works, you would want those birds that survive those things to survive because that makes resistant strains. But instead, what we've done is just say, oh, no, we're going to kill them all. And this just flies in the face of what actual science is, and it flies in the face of productivity. It actually harms us.
It's even this notion of yes, of killing birds rather than than keeping the ones that survive. It blows my mind too. Thomas Massey is on top of it. He invited a farmer to Washington that was talking about exactly those things. Grant, you threw Thelma on this, or Thelema, is it, on the screen earlier? What brought up Thelema in the conversation? And I'm unfamiliar.
I was thought we were going to go down a slightly different track, and so I was going to bring this up. But like there's one of the principles in here. It's "do what thou will shall be the whole of the law." It's like, and then there's an addendum: until you violate the rights of another. Is kind of the whole ethos. I wasn't sure if we were going to go into the philosophical side of this, so I thought I'd cue that up because I was going to bring it up. But that's one of those tenets that, and it was very antithetical to like a rigid, enforceable society. And so you had some of these magicians and anarcho thought thinkers that kind of went way left of where the rest of society was going, even bucking like the Catholic Church and the established rigor that existed within these norms of society. So if you think about how society has been structured with a overarching leviathan, the Catholic Church, I think, is one of the principal vehicles of that. The state is definitely an extension of what religious society typically enforces in the world. And so that's where I thought we might go. So that's why I brought it up, because there's a quote in there about how you actually determine what an individual can and should do. And some anarchists are like, it's free, it's whatever you want, that's what you can do, that's the law, whatever you want. And so it's a difference, I think, between how much anarchy people are willing to take on, or how much just chaos people are willing to go towards. It's a discordant type of philosophy.
Well, go ahead, Adam. Go ahead.
And what I'm advocating for, so to speak, with like voluntarist society, is not that there won't be any rules. I talked about the non-aggression principle, but ultimately you can be a sovereign citizen and go it alone, but that's not going to work for most people. You have to work with other people. And if you join those syndicates or their insurance groups, there's going to be rules and there's going to be fees or quote unquote taxes on those. The difference is, however, though, is if I don't like the rules that you're saying I have to adhere to, well, I don't have to join your syndicate. I can join someone else. If you order a pizza and it gets delivered and it looks like it was half eaten and dropped on the ground, just order pizza from the other competitor. There's no reason why we have to say that, well, because these imaginary lines on the ground where backwards people got tired of fighting each other hundreds of years ago stopped, sets our rules. It's ridiculous. You should be able to pick and choose.
Reminds me of homeowners associations. If you don't like the homeowners association, sell your house and go live in a different homeowners association, or one without one.
True. And homeowners associations are different in the fact that a lot of times they set up their bylaws and governing documents to make them almost impossible to dissolve after the fact that they're no longer needed. But you're right. You can kind of choose those and pick those as you want.
I have a real bone to pick with homeowners associations.
Oh, I do too.
It's modern feudalism. Oh, you're a rancher and you subdivided this land and you want to lay out down the rules.
Well, there is a use case for them if you're, building out some infrastructure and things like that, whether it be like sewer and water and some roads. They make sense. But you look at the governing documents in some of these, and you have to have a quorum of like 90% of the people even consider dissolving it or things like that. And now you're starting to force people into this in perpetuity, where you really need to think about these organizations you join and what is the lifespan of those. If your syndicate, for example, gets too big, there's a certain point where you're going to have inefficiencies like any huge big corporation, and you want to think about splitting it.
Well,
Reminds me of Thomas Jefferson when he said that like we have to have these periodic like overthrows of the government. Isn't that Jefferson?
we have to prune. We have to prune the government from every 20 years. We need a revolution to prune the government. But I think that you're both absolutely correct. When I look at HOAs, I say, what's the difference between a town and an HOA? The town has a living political structure that's put in the town council and put into elections, and HOAs, they through worshiping the document, worshiping the written contract, they carry over the intent of the dead king, the rancher who subdivided this ranch, or the contractor, the builder who bought the ranch and built this place and set up all these rules to be attractive.
I'm going to disagree with you, though, that there's a difference between an HOA and a town. They're both, worshiping some governing declaration document that formed. And really, if you think about it, all the difference between any of these institutions, whether it's a town or a state or a county or even an HOA, is they're just the most powerful gang in an area. And what we do is we call those most powerful gangs in an area government, but they're still gangs. And that's what it really comes to, is can you voluntarily disassociate with that without having to move and pick up your life, go somewhere else? If I have enough neighbors who agree with me and want to form our own rules, we should be allowed to do that, as long as we're not marauding on our neighbors and making sure that our neighbors don't maraud on us. It's really all it comes down to. We don't need to draw these imaginary lines.
Well, it's a difference of degrees. I think the towns have a political structure that's more easy to change than an HOA. Going back to Thelema, part of what caught my eye in that was it was a movement that was created by Aleister Crowley. And as we talk about the West, as we were talking earlier about the West, there was a particular person that that kept coming to my mind. Because when I think about I don't know, the peace of the West and the corruptness of the West, there's a character named Charles Manby who lived in New Mexico, and Charles Manby had an occultist group that would blackmail and intimidate political figures and landowners and everybody else in northern New Mexico. And Manby was a devout follower and he recruited people into these ideas of do what thou wilt, and he lured them out into New Mexico, said, you can do whatever you want out here. But then they got there and they realized that they either had to toe the line of Manby and his gang, or they were they were taken out into the desert and murdered. So this is part. I guess I thought it interesting that you flashed up Thelema and Aleister Crowley, because so much of like I was fascinated with Charles Manby as a child. I love the Old West, and I used to have some of these romantic notions about the peace of the West. But then I found Charles Manby, and I realized, there was a really dark side to what was happening, and taking power out of the hands of the government. You could wind up with characters like Manby and the gang in Taos. That
is this
of course.
No, this is not Charles Manby. Sorry, I gave
So,
you the wrong link.
Lucas, of course you're right. And by no means am I saying if you had a completely voluntary society that you would have utopia. You absolutely wouldn't. There would always be people like this. But the only difference between what you're describing and what we see like the US empire doing to its people and people around the world is one of them terrorizes people locally and one of them throws nuclear bombs on people in other countries. I mean, it's really the same thing. And ultimately, having smaller groups in smaller areas, yes, there's going to be conflict. Yes, there's going to be people who act like animals and don't abide by the non aggression principle, but at least you localize that and you create a lot less death that way.
Well, and I'm, this is part of I think maybe a failure in democracy, or the way that we structure governments today, is that we do exactly that. Instead of taking from ourselves or figuring out what the give amongst ourselves is, we turn on other countries, and this is why empire. I said earlier that we have these romantic notions, romantic, even listen to the word romantic, Roman notions of the agrarian world, and being self-sovereign, and farming and being bound to the land. But the problems of that order in the world are the same problems of the Roman Empire, and we haven't gotten rid of it. I mean, we both privilege immigration, this notion of liberty. People could part of the definition of the Roman Empire was that it wasn't just the bloodlines or the people who were born in the Roman Empire who could become citizens. Those who fought to expand the empire and exploit the neighboring countries to make them pay for the quality of life of the citizens, that was inherent, and we haven't.
Isn't that agrarian? That was the way of settling land. I mean, it is the most canonical and natural form of how you take control of an area. Is you start planting a crop in it, and then you defend the area where you planted a crop. Isn't that how they expanded the borders?
I mean, yes, and how did Israel how has Israel tried to expand their borders into Palestine? By
By
doing the same
settling
thing.
it. By settling it.
And how has the United States done the same thing? We have all of these trade deals with other countries. We have trade deals in Africa. Part of those trade deals were that same USDA going out to other countries of the world and saying, "Oh, we don't want you to raise corn, and we don't want you to raise cotton because we raise that in America. We don't want you to raise wheat because we raise that in America." And those countries are beginning to question and say, "Wait a second. We rely on you for the things that we eat, and you're asking us to grow sort of these marginal things, but then we become dependent on you, especially because we need to eat." So
It's not just aggression though that goes outward to other countries. There's aggression that goes inward. And you already talked about what happened to the native people, but there's even so far as, I don't support blowing up people with bombs halfway around the world. I don't want to be part of murdering those people. But yet at the same time, if I have a paycheck, this institution is going to forcefully take money from me to fund those bombs. And it is just as much inward as outward. And ultimately, there's an old saying, you have to have a roof over your head and you need to work with other people to give you protection and to bind together to share that protective force. But when that protective force starts exploiting either internally or externally, you need to have the ability to have competition to that force.
Yeah, what's my opt out from the federal government? Can I opt out? Can I stop paying taxes?
No way.
well, this again is where I think multiple governments is the actually the solution. And the United States sort of tripped into that with the tension between the federal government and the state governments, and that was part of the success of this sort of bucolic era of America, the laissez-faire, area that anarchists and libertarians love to look back on. But part of the success of that was actually because we had governments fighting against each other, and we could move about between them. So I think
you don't need to fight. And look at a very simple example is your automobile insurance. There's not just one automobile insurance company that covers a geographic area. You get into a car accident with someone else, they may have a different insurer, and your syndicates, your insurance companies have ways to arbitrate that and figure these things out. And on top of that, they're going to put rules on you. If you're caught, being intoxicated while driving all the time, they're going to say you're no longer going to be a part of our group because we're not going to protect you. And this is where I'm getting to, that you don't need to have this fighting, but you don't need to have these geographical boundaries. It's perfectly reasonable to pick and choose where you want to go, and these groups are going to want to be peaceful with each other, and they're going to have arbitration rules.
I don't know about that. Insurance companies would be fighting with each other, and now it's
not with nuclear missiles, not with nuclear warheads.
Well, but part of the reason that that insurance companies don't fight with each other is because, one, they fight with their policyholders.
They do, and there is a point to be made that what we see insurance today has grown too big. But you look at how a lot of these insurance companies started, like the mutuals, they were formed by people just wanting to bind together and share risk. And right now, it's really hard to form a mutual or insurance company with all of the regulation back to what these U.S. empires and state empires are saying you must be beholden to.
But the other hand, the reason that they have success is because they're underwritten by the government.
So, well, I think that there is a world in which, insurance companies with a lot more free association, because I don't even think you have that much competition within insurance. It's starting to get to the point where it's actually quite hard to get insurance. And I think partly it's because of these rules that have been locking insurance companies out from competing. Because if you actually knew what you were getting and you stopped fighting with your policyholders and you started to do what you said you were going to do, you'd probably get more people freely gravitating and moving around. Like we definitely have this this very weird situation where there just isn't that much competition in insurance, and I think that's where you start to see this non-behaving of insurance companies, because they have the backing of federalized monopolies.
Yeah, well, and it's fascism right on its face. It's a pure definition of fascism.
Insurance company is also an interesting place to wind up in this discussion, which we should have again, because
we are coming on time. Actually, I think that might be a good follow-up, like, because we've naturally led ourselves to that, and I think that it is actually one of the places we found ourselves in society. I mean, if you think about what do the police really do, they're not really investigating crime in a lot of situations. What they're doing is they're facilitating insurance.
100%. They are affirming the facts to supply to insurance companies to move that confrontation.
Well, let's pick it up there, because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about how our society is actually functioning and like what the courts are doing. So yeah, let's pick it up there, because like we're painting a picture for what the world might look like, but I think we also have to think about what does the world even look like right now. And I think people who haven't been through a lawsuit really don't understand what the courts do. They don't understand what insurance does, and they don't understand what the police are there to do. So that might be a good place to like pick this up and do part 2 on this, is like, what does our society actually mean?
Oh, I like it. I'm chuckling again. We've gone from anarchism to voluntarism to insurance. You guys are really trying to trigger me today.
It's the natural progression.
It is. Adam, glad to have you.
Yeah, good to be here.
We'll see you next time.
All right. See you guys.